think my studio is not unique, but maybe a little different in how I work in my studio. Like I keep things that are really, that I emotionally respond to. Like I have a 50 little Pez things that just I adore. Or I have 50 or 60 Virgin Mary statues and plastics and all kinds of things. I might have the pot holders, I might have aprons, and I have tons of books, all within my actual creating space of my studio. So that when I put a canvas up and I start to paint, of course I have my paint and my traditional supplies, but I have things that I absolutely adore around my studio. I might turn and see a Virgin Mary standing there, and that all of a sudden that image ends up with my agricultural books of cows. I mean, so everything in my studio is something that I really cherish intellectually or emotionally. And I draw on those objects for the icons. I do figurative work, and I do have the female body is often a part of my work because I want to speak from myself. That's all I know. And so I don't want to, I'm very careful about the boundaries, that I don't want to cross into boundaries. So I stay to what I know in my life, in my emotions, and speak to my own self. And I do use the female body and have used my own as well, so that I'm very careful and respectful of that. But my work tends to always go back to the feminine. I did some work in Honduras, and I taught orphans, young girls, and the fence, you had to enter a very high security area to work with these young girls. And the fence seems dark, but actually it was a safety issue, and it allowed these young girls to be themselves. So that did show up in this work, not as a dark negative, but as a positive. And you can be either a trophy wife or a soft, whichever. It's okay. And so I have a process that I rely on heavily, and that is the 5 senses. I try to have the lights how I like them, which is soft and dark. Sometimes I paint to candlelight. I can barely see what I'm doing. I have incense always going. I have coffee, and then I always have to have headphones in my head, so that the other world is just not present, to try to go to that spot. But I do have something to say, and it doesn't go without, it's not just haphazard. There is a statement or a thought being made. But mostly I want the viewer to have their own story, and hopefully the iconography or the images or the females can relate. And so when going back to your question about male and female, often conversation is developed from both genders regarding the work.
Yeah, simple geometric forms that that become playful. Yeah. Sails, boat forms, circles, globes, squares in combination with other things, patterns broken apart and played with. Most of these are one-ofs. Even ones that I have a few of, every one is a little bit different. So I'm working each plate almost like a painting and working the color and then combining more than one plate. And the beauty of the etching process is that there's an atmospheric quality that I can get from the etching through the way through the lines and through the film of the ink and the way it's printed. Well, usually I draw up more than one plate that I think relates together, and then I'll ink them separately and start combining plates and see what happens. And then there are certain combinations of the plates that, might inspire me, and then I start playing with the color to make certain things stand out more and certain things recede. What I like to do is I'll be inspired by symbols from what I see, symbols from vintage textiles, symbols from things that I pick up from magazines, even scan codes that you supposedly scan into your phone. Those are the patterns from those scan codes even are some inspirations for some of my prints, not necessarily the ones up here, but for other prints. And I'll incorporate them in a dynamic landscape. It's more like just a movement in this space, and I'm dealing with the symbols, movement, and color.
I've thought about that a lot lately. Like, why are my figures more kinetic, more malleable, more almost abstract sometimes, rather than the houses? And I think simply as a working artist, when I look at a house, it never strikes me to make it move in any way, because it's a house, and it's just solid structure, and it's just there, it's not moving anywhere. But a person, in real life, people are always moving all the time, and Picasso obviously picked up on that, with showing the figure from 2 or 3 or 4 different angles, and I think a lot of that had to do with motion, because people are always moving, and we see people, from all different angles, and it can happen like that, Whereas the house doesn't really move around too much, so I think houses and landscapes, I tend to be more conservative, and then when I put the figures in, there's a tendency to try to capture that kind of movement and life, I suppose, that a person actually has. Yeah, most of the stuff I do is based on either my own photographs or sometimes snapshots that I've taken over the years, or friends of mine have taken, I'll have photos that I took when I was a kid up in Canada or someplace, and I'll hang on to them literally for like 25, 35 years, and then I'll pull it out and go, oh man, that's a picture of my uncle's house on Lake Erie, and I've always wanted to paint that, and now is finally the time to do it. I took the picture when I was 12, but now that I'm 47, I actually feel capable of turning it into a painting, and it becomes very nostalgic for me, that sort of thing. I never really go someplace with a sketchbook and sketch whatever's there. I just don't feel comfortable with that for some reason, but I feel comfortable with a camera, and I don't copy the photograph exactly. It's really just a reference point to try to remember, how many windows a house had and how big the tree was behind it and stuff like that. And it all changes anyway once I get going, but I need something to refer to begin with. Usually I go into the studio with an idea of what image I want to paint, and by the time I actually complete the painting, I have no idea what that image was to begin with, because it's changed so much, it's evolved, And there's a few paintings I've done where I go in with a particular idea, and then 2 or 3 days later I'm still working on the same image. Maybe a month later or a year later, whatever, how long it takes, it'll still be there, but very rarely, it's almost always a lot of give and take, push and pull, and just trying to imagine things. A lot of times I'll start out with a figurative piece, and then about maybe 2 days into it, I realize that it's not quite working for me, so I might turn it on the side, and it'll suggest a landscape, so I'll turn the painting into a landscape, and vice versa. I might start with a landscape and then turn that on its side, and it becomes a figure. And also, if I turn it upside down, I might get an idea for an abstract piece, and it'll go from realism to abstraction, back and forth.
This is a new body of work completed in 2010. Like a lot of my pieces, I work in series somewhat, but I sort of work in evolutionary circles, I think, in a lot of the work. This is I'm on a way to simplification, I guess, because I tend to work in really complex, dense prints, and then as I'm working with them, I find simpler truths within them, and I sort of evolve into simpler prints. So these seem to be an evolution for me of more simpler forms and simpler space than the pieces I've been recently engaged in. And I sort of have a reputation for using a lot of color, but I decided that it was too seductive for me, so I thought I would just eliminate all the color. There's a little touch of warm color in some of these, warm cool, but in essence they're monochromatic, black and white, or neutral anyway, because I wanted to concentrate more on the forms. I try to think of them in some sort of musical terms as well, because I think I don't come to making these as knowing exactly what they're going to be when they're done. I come to them like I sort of imagine somebody comes to music by like humming a tune and then suddenly it becomes a symphony. You know, I have a certain thought, and it's a visual thought, and it, you know, it stays with me, and it grows and it develops and it becomes more complex and it takes on sort of a meaning. One of my favorite activities was I used to like the idea of getting lost, you know, so I sort of think about that when I'm making art too. I like to sort of go in and be lost and not really have a clear pathway, because to me the most exciting part about being an artist is discovering something. And so I'm entertaining myself and discovering my solutions while I work, and I think that's what makes it fun and engaging for me as an artist. I think of this one a lot with different speeds. I was really thinking a lot about slowness, fastness, complexity and simplicity, and you know, and alluding to somewhat maybe musical notes, and sort of anchored heaviness and this sort of latent complexity that sort of floats through like a thought might pass through your brain. These are made in steps. They're not all done at once. The print evolves in layers. And some of these are actually pieced together. I assemble parts to make wholes. This one has a separate piece on the bottom. It's just to make it larger. A former painter, I had this notion that I should keep getting larger and larger.
She's a sorceress who's surrounded by animals. She's on an island and surrounded by animals, and the animals she's surrounded by are actually men that she's turned into these creatures who fawn over her. And I liked this idea of this innocent young girl who could also exist as temptress without necessarily realizing that she had that power. I mean, she's just sort of, you know, looking up at the viewer, and it's whatever personal baggage we bring to it, because on one level she's sort of staring you down, and on another level she's sort of seducing you. And what I really love about this painting in particular is that she watches you and she follows you across the room. She sort of haunts you, and I'm really attracted to, that's how I'm attracted to images. If there's something that just sort of haunts me so much that that experience has to be painted, that sort of helps me decide, you know, what imagery I'm going to be working with. My paintings are landscapes completely populated by young women, and it's because at this time period, a young woman is so self-centered, you know, and so self-involved, because you're really learning to be who you are, that that's just an area that I'm more interested in. And also my personal experiences growing up as a young woman in upstate New York, middle-class family. It's a very specific experience that I have, and I feel like it would be sort of dishonest of me to be making work about adolescent males. It's not an experience that I've had. I believe that whether you're making art or you're writing, you know, you should make work about what you know, and this is my personal experience. I'm very interested in how the meaning changes completely when it's cropped. When we change the clothing. I try to make my work very contemporary, even though this painting in particular is referencing almost like a Hans Holbein sort of color palette. I think it's very important to have a work of art reflect the society of the times. So I'm interested in, you know, right now coral is becoming a very important color in interior design. It's starting to work its way into homes, which isn't something that we've seen, you know, for a while. So it's sort of a more contemporary color at the moment. I will change fashion to try to, I'll change clothing to something that's, you know, what just happened in 17 magazine last month, you know, trying to work those things in. Painting is looking at the overlooked and bringing some significance to that moment and causing the viewer to sort of fall in love with the moments that you fall in love with, whether it's, you know, the cast of light or this beautiful glow that happens on her cheek. That's sort of just a beautiful poetic moment, and we're surrounded by beautiful moments all of our lives, these little moments of magic. And I think it's important to, when we find something that's so beautiful, to capture that, to share that. And I sort of feel like I approach them like a teenage crush. When a teenager falls in love, they memorize every detail. You know, it's that every lock of hair and every cast of light. And I try to just fall in love with the moment I'm painting and try to capture every detail right down to these tiny little, you know, the tiny little hairs. So it's very obsessive for me that sort of the way that the pre-Raphaelites felt that they were giving glory to God by trying to recapture something that never really could be completely recaptured. So for me, every painting has to be a little bit of a love story.
It's all within the process. I go by this one kind of, I guess, mantra, you could say. Process saves us from the poverty of our intentions. So I have a little bit of an idea in mind of what I want to do by just looking at in books and researching different machines that were made. And then I take reference from that, and then through the material I kind of figure out like a puzzle on like how to put it together. And also I've been making collages that I go around and take pictures of buildings that are falling apart, or just go around in junkyards, take pictures of those things, and then I print them out and then cut them out really intricately. So each piece that I cut out is almost an object in itself. So kind of making a sculpture with the collages, with the photographs. And those end up being sort of like sculptural proposals or ideas that I want to work out, or sometimes even ideas that I want to make, but there's no way in the world I can make it, even if I had the materials. A lot of my inspiration for this piece comes from a Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. And in it, he talks about the woven cloth, saying that it can't be created without, it cannot be in existence without going through the human hand and the process. So that's where I get my inspiration for this piece. Each piece that I use has some sort of symbolic connection. So the mud is this like creation element, like it came from the mud. And the cotton gin is a machine that I looked at when making this. When someone recognizes a piece of the machinery or a piece of found object that's in my work, it kind of gives them a point to jump off of and use their imagination to kind of propel themselves into what this might mean to them specifically. There is a destruction decay part to it, but there's always a little bit of hope for regeneration in there. I feel like maybe from the idea, the fact that it might inspire the idea of movement to bring this thing back to life. So even if it's not like implied, there's not like bright colors or light or something to kind of justify the regeneration, but it's implied just by someone being able to look at this and use their imagination, I guess. Sometimes I do sketch. I usually get the materials first, and then I organize them in a way that I'm like, okay, this could be possibly used for that, or if they're relations by shape and form. And then, I just start playing. And then after I play around and see how things might fit, then I can go in and sketch, and I do a little more research and everything. They help me understand the process on how to start building something. So it's usually like I'll start building, when I build the actual physical sculpture, it's the skeleton, and then the rest of it is almost like the skin that's on the body. So in the same way I build the sculptures that way, so I could also understand if I were to use those materials I took pictures of, how would I build that, and how can I take it from paper and put it in 3D. My reference comes from a lot of military machinery, agriculture, and construction equipment. So it's just like this fascination, this sort of process from something starting at one point and becoming something else, again, that like sort of alchemy, changing a material.
Most of my work is based on site-specific areas, usually transitional areas that I'm investigating. In this case, the works that I have up are actually along the ridge in the Arkwright Hills outside of Fredonia where I live, so it's local, which is, I guess, a new thing for me to do something actually more locally. And there is a proposed wind farm going in, and which has been delayed now for several years. It's called New Grange. It's by Horizons. And I guess to me, what becomes really interesting is that, of course, it's very controversial. First of all, the wind energy is being touted as the new green energy, but we really don't always consider the effects that it has on the landscape. To me, what's really interesting is this transition of that landscape. How do you view it? Is it a landscape? Is it more sublime? Is it more economic? What I'm trying to investigate is what is our concept of landscape, of course, in nature, and that's changed over time as our use of landscape and the natural world has changed. And there's been these shifts in how we treat it and how we view it. So it's the potential of this transformation between what it is now into what it's going to become with these huge turbines and the clear cutting for the power lines, but also a power source. somewhat methodological. I had this methodology in terms of how I gather it, doing the sites, doing the collecting, because that's certainly a way of depicting something, categorizing it. But then, combining these into my works, there's a lot of just visual, formal decisions that come in. It's not dictated by the information or necessarily, I guess my visual agenda becomes stronger in the end than my political views or what I want to get across in terms of content.
This body of work is a bit of a departure for me. Instead of collage, which I usually do, I've incorporated a lot of different materials, but they all start from a found object of sorts. This one, a poster of the New York City landscape with the World Trade Towers painted over and replaced by a new museum called the Canyon Museum. But this body of work, what it really has to do with for me is personalization of more mass-produced objects. Not so much my own personalization of them, but the act of people personalizing objects and moments and how we can use them to create our own identity. I'm interested in using imagery that people can relate to in some way, that people are aware of, and imagery and events that certainly each person that looks at the work has their own personal connection with it, be it positive or negative. They're very aware of what I'm referencing. I don't especially want to change their view of any one event or some sort of iconography, as much as point out what in history has become those icons and what has become those historical points of reference. Titles are important to me. They just seem to be another opportunity to kind of add another layer of sorts. But lots of times, I'll be honest, I'll go through about 10 titles for a piece, and not until I have a show like this where the label is made is the title totally decided on. This piece is entitled Ebony Archie, and that's all sewn in, and that took quite a time, but again, that process of personalization and personalizing an object and spending time with it, I just enjoy that process. Even though I never really watched Archie Bunker or anything, just the idea. This one's called Golden Christ, how we view our icons, especially our religious icons, place of stature that we give them, and if by placing them so high and untouchable, if they become a little harder to see through the gold. This one is actually called Southwest. Lots of these works come from, I accumulate things and I collect things and imagery, and lots of times one or two will just pop out to me, and I'll save it knowing at some point I'm going to do something with it. So I had this one for a while, this image of the Grand Canyon, which I always held very close to me.
My work is watermarks. It's a continuing series that I have. I'm very drawn to taking photographs of water and surfaces that reflect things that are there but not physically not there. And so this particular series is from San Francisco, the three that are behind me now. Just sand, water from the air, from the shoreline. I find sort of a peaceful movement in taking pictures of water. I think it's things that people ignore. I keep the horizon line out of my water images for the most part, and particularly in this series, because I want to create a new space, something that we're not grounded in. I'm hoping to really kind of upend the viewer and try and find out if they know where they're looking, what they're looking at. Some of these are from an airplane, the shoreline, from a ship. So all of these various perspectives, and yet there's nothing to place the viewer. I'm hoping that people can find their own stories in it. Perhaps it's a color that they like. Perhaps it's some of the small movements that take place in the images that, maybe they'll find some sort of story that they're making up. And I like that when a viewer can take my images and move them into their own space. When I set out to take these photographs, and it is an ongoing series, it's many of them really vacation photographs. It's a quiet space. I kind of let everything else fade away, the people behind me or traffic or whatever, and really begin to just look at these spaces and zero in. And it's very Zen-like, it's very contemplative. It's just sort of a place to either think a lot or not think at all.
Since we're having a group show with 10 people, I wanted to do some larger works, but I wanted to not sort of crowd other people out. And so my first inclination was to seek out nooks or niches or, spaces that are not usually inhabited, that wouldn't be in people's way, and that like this idea of sort of parasitic architecture or a camouflage sort of construct, or something that looks like it's been here, and that when one enters it, they're completely thrown into a different scenario. Like in these two cases, there's spaces that look like residential house components, like a basement and an attic, were my inspirations for the spaces. They're not literal translations of those types of spaces, but that was at least my starting point. I enjoy either triggering memories in people, in the viewer, or in making people imagine that they've had these memories. It's sort of paraphrase of a memory. I've read a lot of Kafka in my day, and so I think about, you know, there's references in his novels where you'll be going through this labyrinthine corridor and open up a closet, and in that closet somebody's getting whipped. And there's this complete disconnect between the actual environment and then what's inside, and so I like having that hermetic space where a viewer can be separated from and enclosed by the space. I have a Roman Catholic background, which is, you know, way in my past, but it's the gift that keeps on giving. And so there's a connection in a lot of that architecture between the movement of the body within the space, between different states at different junctures in the space. So if one were to enter from the outside, one would experience some sort of transformative process or receive some sort of answer to a question and then emerge enlightened or disturbed or bothered, or in some sense. I like to suggest that my pieces be viewed one at a time, and that there's no familiar bearing between, like, if you go in with another person, there's Mary that you're going in with, and you recognize her, and there's this common sort of connection. And I think what happens is if you go in alone, there's a sort of spell that's cast by being enveloped by something. And it's not to say that it works for every artist, or that it's more of a rich experience than other types of artwork. But certainly it's something that resonates with me and something that I really like to communicate to people. The concept with these two pieces was that I could build two installations in this space that relate to each other. And since I'm interested in things that relate to psychology and inner states, I named the two pieces Broca and Wernicke, which are two language processing compartments of the brain. And so I think in a lot of ways, art is a process of formulating language and communicating the view of the artist to the individual or the viewer, and that's kind of the real impetus behind all this. Some of my vision deals with creating a hermetic environment, and it takes a lot to fill volumetric space so that, you know, a spell can be completely created that takes the viewer out. You know, if you go into a space that's supposed to be hermetic and you see cracks of daylight coming through and you can see the other side or hear other people on the other side, it kind of tends to break the spell. So for me, that becomes part of the obsession of making, is to try to, as you said, fill the space.
Hello, it is April 2nd. We are here in the ArtSpace for mark making. April 2nd, 2011. In between.
This is your interview. You just put a microphone in front of my face and you want me to just say anything about anything at all. They want you to just, it's like Penn and Teller are doing this, I guess.
Did they set this up?
That's why we're doing it. So there we go.
I got nothing to say.
What am I saying?
I'm not sure. I'm still forming my opinion.
No way. Are you being dead serious right now? Where's it gonna go?
Inshallah.
What are you asking?